Hello, and welcome to a Rodent's guide on the Mandrakes in Kill Team 2024. This video will serve as a general introduction to the Mandrakes Kill Team, as well as a specialist video for those that have played the team before. I actually just got back from taking the Mandrakes to the World Championships of Warhammer 2024 in Atlanta, Georgia, where I placed 23rd overall out of 93 players. My final record was 6-4, with 3 of my 4 losses being against the Chaos Legionnaires. Losses were also 3 or fewer points, which was pretty cool, and I was awarded the Best in Faction award for my placement with the Mandrakes. So I figured it was time that I released a guide for that faction for everyone to see. Like always, there will be timestamps in the description below to help you navigate this guide. My name is Mouse. Let's get into the video. The Mandrakes team has the same composition options that it did in KT21. It's a 9-model mid-range team with 2 major operative categories. These categories are Specialists and Warriors, which we'll detail shortly. The Specialist models all have a unique element that they bring to the team, but the Warrior Operatives pull a lot of the weight as the standard melee fighters for the team as well. Before we talk Operatives, let's run through the faction rules for the Mandrakes Kill Team. The first faction ability is their signature Soul Strike keyword, which is present on all of their Balefire ranged attacks. This ability affects how the opponent's defense dice are determined, and instead of using their armor save value, they use their APL at the time of the attack. Each result that they roll that is higher than their APL is a fail and is discarded, with results of 1 being a critical success. It's important to note that this looks at the APL at the time the target is receiving that shooting attack, so temporary APL buffs from comms operatives or APL penalties can affect the target's saves. As a general rule, this keyword makes it easier to push through damage on most targets, especially against enemies like the Hyrotech Circle, who go from saving on 3+ to saving on 1s and 2s in most cases. Next, let's look at the faction condition Within Shadow. This condition is met when any of the following are true for the operative in question. 1, it is within 1 inch of heavy terrain that's not lower than it. 2, any part of its base is underneath a vantage point. And or 3, a shadow portal marker is within its control range. This Within Shadow condition can apply to both friendly and enemy operatives, depending on the situation where it's relevant, and this is the bread and butter of the Mandrakes team. It is paramount that Mandrakes players keep track of whether or not they are in shadow when it comes to executing their game plans. The third signature faction ability for the Mandrakes Kill Team is their Shadow Passage ability. This allows you to, once per turning point, perform a form of teleportation with a Mandrake operative instead of using its usual reposition action. There are a lot of restrictions for this, understandably, so let's break it down. First, the friendly Mandrake operative has to be within shadow, which we described before, and it can only teleport to a location that is also within shadow on the other end as well. When the operative is set up at the end of its teleportation, it cannot be in control range of an enemy operative, it cannot be a valid target for an enemy operative, and it cannot perform a shoot or fight action until the start of the next turning point. It can retaliate if someone fights them, but they cannot instigate any offensive actions after their shadow passage. Another key trick to this ability is that it doesn't require visibility for you to teleport. This means, critically, that on maps like Gallowdark, you are able to teleport through closed doors because you are not moving through them, but rather being placed at the target destination. The final faction ability for the Mandrakes team is called Umbral Entities. This ability allows all Mandrake operatives to ignore the piercing weapon key rule by default, and it improves the save characteristic of all Mandrakes operatives by 1 if they are within shadow. This ability helps increase the general survivability of the team by ignoring big armor-piercing threats from opposing teams, and it's the first example of many as to why we want our operatives to be within shadow as frequently as possible. Let's now talk about the operative options for the Mandrakes team. The leader for this team is the Mandrake Night Fiend, who comes with a whole host of board control abilities to start us off. Like all other operatives for the team, he is 2 APL, has a 7-inch move, and natively comes with a 5-up save. The Night Fiend does get a typical wound increase for leaders in this edition, bringing his wound count up to 9 wounds total. He has the standard Mandrake shooting profile of 4 attacks hitting on 3s with 3/4 damage and Soul Strike. He has a slightly better bolter when you factor in Soul Strike, but no other weapon keywords. His melee profile, however, is pretty imposing. His Husk Blade comes with 5 attacks, hitting on 3s with 4, 6, lethal 5, and shock. This already makes him a deadly operative, but let's dive into his 2 abilities. The first is his Oubliette, which gives him a 5-up chance every time he takes damage from an attack die to ignore that damage completely. This ability will continue to trigger until it successfully blocks an attack die, after which it remains dormant until either this operative becomes readied at the beginning of a turning point, or it gets a kill with its Husk Blade in combat. This means that the Oubliette can block both normal and critical attacks, and can be used multiple times in a single turning point. For instance, you could charge into an enemy operative, fight them, potentially shrug off their returning hit, then kill them and recharge the Oubliettes, all in a single activation. This model is an absolute nightmare for operatives with 10 or fewer wounds on their operatives. The second ability for the leader is called Harrowing Whispers, and it is the first example of the board control that makes the Mandrakes team so impactful. This ability states that when your opponent would activate an enemy operative within 6 of this operative, you can choose to roll a d6, and if the result of your roll is higher than that enemy operative's APL, it cannot activate. Instead, your opponent must choose to activate a different operative for this activation. Crucially, this ability does not require visibility and has no limit to the number of times that it can activate. It can also activate on the same model multiple times throughout a turning point, which can be really infuriating to your opponent if they have a critical operative that they need to activate before other ones. This ability does state that if there are no other enemy operatives eligible to be activated, this ability has no effect, but remember that this ability says that you can choose to roll to deny their activation. You don't have to. So if you see a play that your opponent is attempting to make and you are okay with that happening, you can let it go through. This has important synergy implications with the Dirge Maul operative, but I'll touch on that later. The next specialist operative for the Mandrake team is the Abyssal, who acts as this team's gunner operative. They have the standard Mandrake chassis, but come with 2 shooting profiles. Both profiles are 5 attacks, hitting on 3s with 3-4 damage and soul strike, but you can choose between having lethal 5 up or a 2-inch blast radius. Fun fact, if you are playing on a Gallo Dark board, the 2-inch blast profile will give you lethal 5 anyway, so you might be able to dish out some serious firepower on multiple operatives in confined quarters. Some heavy shooting can come out of this operative, more so than the other Mandrake operatives, so this is the one operative I can routinely rely on to output good range damage. The Abyssal also has the Wreathe and Balefire action for 1 AP, which adds some utility to this gunner operative. You select a visible operative, and they are wreathed in Balefire until the start of the Abyssal's next activation, until the Abyssal is incapacitated, or until the Abyssal performs this action again, whichever comes first. While an operative is wreathed in Balefire, if it is an enemy operative, all friendly Mandrake shooting attacks against that operative deal 1 more damage and have the Saturate rule. If the wreathed operative is a friendly Mandrake, it takes 1 less damage from all shooting attacks against it to a minimum of 1 damage each. This ability can be really helpful to add some extra juice to our shooting if we're trying to bring down a difficult target, like an elite Space Marine, or it can help protect a key friendly operative if they need to push up and be vulnerable to enemy shooting. I'll discuss a particular combo related to this later in the video once we get to the tips and tricks. The primary melee specialist for the squad is the Chooser of the Flesh, who has a standard Mandrake chassis with an upgraded melee weapon in the form of his Bale Blade. This weapon is still 4 attacks, hitting on 3s, but with 5-6 damage, brutal and lethal 5. This model can reliably hit that 10 wound benchmark with 2 attacks, making him an important tool in certain matchups. He also has 2 innate abilities to help him do his job: Part Collector and Soul Harvest. Part Collector simply states that when an enemy operative performs the fallback action while within control range, you can choose to inflict 2d3 damage on that operative before it moves. It's an annoying gotcha ability that might sneak out some extra damage on a vulnerable enemy, but otherwise this niche ability almost never comes up. The Chooser's second ability, Soul Harvest, however, is a unique mechanic that can really dial up this Mandrake team to 11. Whenever an enemy operative is incapacitated as a result of the Part Collector ability or from this operative's Bale Blade, you gain 1 Soul Harvest point, or 2 if that enemy operative has an APL stat of 3 or more. Whenever a friendly Mandrake operative is activated, you can then spend one of your Soul Harvest points to either add one to its APL stat for the rest of the game, or have it regain up to 2d3 lost wounds. Importantly, these Soul Harvest points can be spent even if this operative becomes incapacitated. Primarily, this will manifest by giving strategic operatives a permanent 1 additional APL for the rest of the game, but it can be used to heal a critical operative if needed. I rarely get more than 1 or 2 Soul Harvest points during a game, but they can be incredibly impactful on the options available to you. As such, your opponent is likely to kill the chooser as quickly as they can once you send him in, so keep that in mind when you're designing your strategy. If the chooser is able to generate more than 2 Soul Harvest points, you are going to have a significant utility advantage compared to the normal function of the team. The first of the utility specialists for the Mandrakes team is the Dirge Maw, who, like the Night Fiend, controls the board by affecting your opponent's ability to activate their operatives. Their first ability is Haunting Focus, which grants you a strategic gambit at the beginning of every turning point as long as the Dirge Maw is still alive. You can select one enemy operative, and until the ready operative's step of the next turning point, they gain your Haunting Focus token. Whenever your opponent activates a model with the Haunting Focus token, if the Dirge Maw is ready, you can interrupt that activation and activate the Dirge Maw instead. If you do, during that activation, the Dirge Maw must shoot or fight the operative that has your Haunting Focus token, and if that isn't possible, you're not able to interrupt that activation with this ability. After you complete the Dirge Maw's activation, you then continue that enemy operative's activation if possible. This is a very powerful ability, so let's unpack some of the utility here. First, this ability doesn't require line of sight or have any condition at all that requires you to select who gets your Haunting Focus token. This means that you can automatically shut down any opening gambits from your opponent as long as this operative is alive and can physically reach that operative in question to shoot or fight them. This is a great insurance policy against that sort of strategy. Second, this ability is not required to trigger, meaning that if you select an enemy operative to haunt and they activate it, but your plans have changed and you don't want to activate the Dirge Maw, you don't have to do so. Sometimes your plans will change throughout a turning point, and it's nice to not have to commit to a play that you designed at the beginning of the turning point when you don't have to. Third, if you manage to incapacitate the target of your Haunting Focus, you effectively skip your opponent's activation because their operative is then unable to complete their activation. Priority then shifts back to you like normal, letting you go immediately again after using the Dirge Maw. Sometimes this can mean that you complete an activation, interrupt your opponent with the Dirge Maw, kill the guy that was going to go, and then proceed to activate a third model of yours to continue the turn. This level of tempo control can be absolutely backbreaking if your opponent falls into your traps. The other ability of the Dirge Maw is Periidolic Projection, which is a 1 AP action that the Dirge Maw can use to debuff an enemy operative until the Dirge Maw's next activation. This debuff requires the target to either be a valid target or within shadow, and it subtracts 2 inches from their movement, worsens their weapon skill by 1 for all attacks, and prevents that operative from gaining any additional APL. It also removes any additional APL that they're currently benefiting from, making it an effective counter to early comms usage from your opponent. This ability can really hamper your opponent's ability to stage effectively, and I try to make sure that someone is affected by this whenever the Dirge Maw isn't actively trying to control the board using Haunting Focus. The final specialist for the Mandrakes team is the Shade Weaver, whose job is to facilitate board-wide movement for the team. They have 2 abilities on their data card, each of which costs 1 AP. The first, Shadow Portal, expands on the standard Mandrake Shadow Passage by creating a permanent tether wherever the Shade Weaver starts and ends their teleport. You can put down a Shadow Portal token within control range before and after you perform the Shadow Passage ability, after which all other friendly Mandrake operatives can use the Shadow Portal without it counting against the team's usage of Shadow Passage for the turning point. It can be really important to bring several members of the team across the board to shore up a particular flank, so this ability can help you get those members there in a timely fashion. This Shadow Portal also persists even if the Shade Weaver is incapacitated, meaning that the utility of the portal can come back into play later if your opponent forgets about it and you need to shuffle multiple operatives around again. The second ability of the Shade Weaver is Weave Darkness, which effectively creates a smoke grenade at any point that is visible to this operative. It functions the same way as a standard smoke grenade, except that it doesn't fade at the beginning of the next turning point. It only disappears when you recast the Weave Darkness ability or the Shade Weaver is incapacitated. This ability can be used alongside the Shadow Portal action, either to protect the operatives that come through the portal from being shot off the board, or as a way to protect multiple sides of the board by dropping a smoke on one side and then teleporting to the other. It's important to remember that the Shadow Portal is a two-way street, meaning that you can open the portal over to someone and they can take the portal back. The remainder of the Mandrakes team is made up of warrior operatives. Conventionally, this will be 4 warrior operatives unless you find yourself really not wanting to take one of the specialists for some reason. The Mandrake Warrior is the same chassis that we've been seeing thus far, but with the passive Shadow Warrior ability, which grants them 1 additional critical damage if they are within shadow when they're in melee combat. This can be a lot more important than it looks on paper, since some teams really hate the power weapon breakpoints of 4-6 damage with lethal 5 up. They don't bring a lot of firepower to the team, but their melee prowess is no joke and really helps this team cut down their enemies. With the operatives in the back of our mind, we can now take a look at the strategic and firefight ploys available to the team. Creeping Horror is our first strategic ploy on the list, and it can give the Mandrakes that slippery mobility that most Eldari teams are known for. After each enemy's activation, before the next operative is activated, you can perform a free dash action with 1 friendly Mandrake operative that has a conceal order, and only if it starts and ends that action within shadow. This ploy cannot be used during the first turning point, and you cannot select each friendly operative more than once per turning point to take this free dash action. This ploy can be devastating to your opponent if you want to stage just outside their charge ranges and then dash your operatives into range right before you activate them. Oftentimes, I find that the game just becomes a little too messy to make full use of this ploy, especially because there are some really good ploys that I'm always spending command points on, but this one can really catch your opponent off guard and create a lot of value for you in turning point 2 or onward. Once your operatives start sitting around with engage orders, this ploy gets a lot less value. If you practice this team a lot, you'll start to get the hang of how to stage for the next turn with this ploy in mind, which will really elevate your gameplay into being a total nightmare. Gloaming Shroud is our next strategic ploy, which allows each friendly Mandrake operative to retain 1 of your defense dice automatically and in addition to a cover save if it is within shadow. Since you pretty much always want your operatives to be within shadow, this should nearly always be active, and unlike a cover save, your opponent can't take it away. If you anticipate being shot a lot in a given turn, consider spending for Gloaming Shroud to keep most of that firepower at bay. The combination of Gloaming Shroud and a 4-up invulnerable save means that you are likely saving 2 dice every time you get shot, and that's not even counting if you get a cover save. Anyone shooting you with 4 dice and hitting on 4s is unlikely to do anything to you at all, and even if you're standing in the open, but you have to be next to a wall. Blade in the Dark is short and simple. Friendly Mandrake operatives can perform the charge action with a conceal order as long as it starts or ends that action within shadow. Note that it says you only have to start or end within shadow, not both. On most boards nowadays, you'll be hard-pressed to find yourself in a spot where neither of those things are possible. Spending 1 command point to basically get the entire faction ability of the Commandos team is awesome, but keep in mind that your opponent can still shoot you if they get close enough to ignore the cover anyway. You'll get the hang of using this after a couple of times, but it won't be an auto use like it seems on paper. It's best to use this when you can rush an opponent's forward operatives that are too far forward from their allies to make sure that someone doesn't just walk up to you and shoot you anyway. Speaking of auto-use ploys, Inescapable Nightmare is pretty much that for this team. Whenever a friendly Mandrake operative is shooting, fighting, or retaliating, if it is within shadow, you can re-roll 1 of your attack dice. Nice and simple, but you'll want this increase to reliability since we have precious little access to rerolls otherwise. Be careful of enemy operatives that can turn off rerolls, but otherwise this is pretty much getting played every turn starting in turning point 2. Moving into Firefight ploys, Slither Out of Sight allows us to select 1 friendly Mandrake operative at the end of their activation if they have an engage order and are within shadow. You can change that operative's order to conceal. This won't get used all the time, but it can be a nice way to protect a key operative after they perform some offensive action. Our operatives usually don't last that long, so preventing easy trades from our opponent will go a long way for us. Soul Feast is an uncommon ploy, but it has been important for me on occasion. You can use this ploy at the end of the resolve attack dice step when a friendly Mandrake operative is shooting, fighting, or retaliating against an enemy operative within 6 inches of it. That friendly operative regains a number of lost wounds equal to that enemy operative's APL stat, multiplied by the number of your attack dice that inflicted damage during that sequence. Note that excess dice are ignored. You cannot use this ploy if that friendly Mandrake operative is incapacitated, and because of our weapon profiles, this most commonly is healing for 4 wounds against an APL 2 team and 6 wounds against a 3 APL team. Depending on the enemy team, this is probably only preventing about 4 wounds or 1 of their attack dice for 1 CP, so it can be hard to justify sometimes. However, it can force your opponent to dedicate one of their big weapons into someone that they thought was out of the fight already, which can help increase the survivability of other operatives. It's a situational ploy for sure, but it has its moments where it can matter. Nowhere to Hide is another board control element, this time in the form of a Firefight ploy. During a friendly Mandrake operative's activation, when it performs an action in which it moves, you can use this ploy. Until the end of that activation, that operative can move through parts of terrain features as if they were not there, but it must end those moves in a location that it can be placed. Basically, once per turn, you can have an operative of yours walk through walls like a ghost. This completely changes how your operatives can threaten enemy operatives, distort charging distances, and can invalidate equipment that your opponent has placed to slow you down. You still have to pay to climb and drop like normal, but traversing costs are all 0 for the activation. This includes repositions and dashes if relevant. Practicing how this affects your ability to present threat on the board will go a long way to increasing the presence of this team on the game board. And oftentimes, just reminding your opponent that, hey, by the way, I can walk through walls, is enough to make your opponents overthink things and misplay anyway. Shadow's Bite is our last Firefight ploy, which has a pretty narrow set of activation conditions. Use this ploy when an enemy operative performs the fight action during an activation in which it performed the charge action and selects a friendly Mandrake operative within Shadow to fight against. In the resolve attack dice step of that sequence, you resolve the first attack die. Unfortunately, you have to declare this ploy before dice get rolled for the combat, so you still definitely run the risk of whiffing, but if you have Inescapable Nightmare active, that should help give you some insurance. This can really turn the table on a flank, however, so make sure that you are giving yourself the option to use this ploy by remaining in Shadow if you think your opponent is going to charge in and fight you. It is especially punishing if your opponent forgets and they charge you with a low wound count model, so you can just one-shot them before you take any damage. Okay, real quick, let's look at some strengths and weaknesses. The Mandrakes team lives up to being part of the arguably most canonically evil faction in the 40k universe. They have a ton of board control options to employ, and they really just throw a wrench in your opponent's game. They've been restricted to revolve a lot around the concept of within Shadow, but honestly, on boards like Vulcus, there's just so much heavy terrain that it hardly restricts them at all. The team has a nice mix of gotchas and just generally difficult to handle mechanics, meaning that even if a player has played against the Mandrakes team before, they can still fall victim to some of their tools. They are especially painful into teams that fold to their standard 4-5 or 4-6 melee weapon profiles. On the flip side, they really struggle to dent elite teams like Legionaries and Plague Marines, where they just cannot reliably trade into their operatives. Missions that don't score until the end of the game can also be quite challenging for this team, since they don't have a lot of staying power. The only reason that they would be able to have any staying power on the table is because they've killed most of the other team, which doesn't always work out. Like we discussed with the Orc Commandos, the Mandrakes have a gimmick play that they can reliably execute when using the Gather Surveillance tack-on. If you're playing on Vulcus terrain, and the Tier 2 Vantage is in your opponent's territory, you can teleport one of your operatives up there and just camp out, gathering surveillance for the remainder of the game. Because we're on a 20 mil base, you can position yourself so that you can't be charged, and unless your opponent has access to Seek Light, you'll never be threatened. Even if they do have Seek Light, tossing a smoke grenade or Weave Darkness up there will make sure that you are always obscured and take next to no damage. You can even add in Gloaming Shroud if you're extra worried or they can ignore obscurity. I always select Gather Surveillance if I'm on Vulcus for exactly this reason, which effectively secures me 9 victory points as long as I keep that plan in mind. I found it extremely difficult to execute Gather Surveillance against Horde teams, however, so I would steer clear of that tac op in those matchups. I think that the Mandrakes match up best into other mid-range teams since they struggle into elite teams and are susceptible to counterattacks when out-activated by Horde teams. They can still kill plenty of Horde operatives, but a KG Horde player will make you work to keep those operatives alive. There are so many interactions and tricks to this team, it would be impossible to cover them all here. I'm also certain that there are plenty that I haven't even discovered yet. With that said, here are some tasty morsels to get you started. Like I mentioned earlier, you can layer the Night Fiend's Harrowing Whispers ability with the Dirge Maw's Haunting Focus. If you really don't want your opponent to be able to activate a particular operative, you can attempt to lock them down with Harrowing Whispers and use Haunting Focus as a backup to ensure that you'll get some initial play first. I'll do this particular trick against elites, where I know that I'm going to likely need 2 to 3 activations to bring down one of their guys. Just be careful that you don't drip feed your operatives into the enemy. Sticking with the Dirge Maw, remember how I said that you need to be able to shoot or fight the target of your Haunting Focus? Well, sometimes you can select operatives that are really important to your opponent's game plan, even if your operative seems like it absolutely cannot reach them with a charge. Your opponent might think, well, I'll just activate this guy to invalidate Haunting Focus, but forgets that you can pay a command point to walk through walls, which enables you to get that charge or get a shot off. Similarly, you can use the dashes from Creeping Horror to adjust the ranges of your Dirge Maw and Night Fiend, if relevant. A general playstyle tip is to not forget the overall crit op mission or how to execute on your tac op. It's easy to get caught up in the bloodshed and want to utilize your efficient melee profiles, but you score a lot of your points in the game through efficient management of game state and tempo. Throw your opponent game plan for a loop with your activation control and the operative maneuverability that you have, and then capitalize on those openings. You don't have to kill everything, and there will definitely be games where that's not even a realistic strategy. Okay, moving into some pitfalls that the team can succumb to. Picking up where the previous section ended, a common pitfall for the Mandrakes team is that they just don't stick around very well. They have decent defense against shooting attacks with their invuln saves and Glooming Shroud, but they suffer from trading in melee unless they're into really weak combat profiles. Any team that can field 4 damage weapons, in either shooting or melee, can 2-shot our operatives, and it feels very oppressive. Make sure that you have a patient strategy in mind against teams that can use those tools against us, and see if you can pick apart that strategy with your board control. This is doubly true if you're playing on a mission that requires you to do things at the end of the game or wait to score on objectives. The Mandrakes team is pretty command point hungry. In some instances, going first in a turn too often actually starves you out of command points in a game. And you can sometimes afford to go second if you are comfortable relying on your board control tools like the Night Fiend and the Dirge Maw. Make sure you budget your command points and try to only spend when you think you're going to get good value. Inescapable Nightmare is pretty much used every turn, but all of your others can be situational and require justification. The Soul Strike keyword on Mandrake shooting attacks is fun and flavorful, but their shooting is truthfully just a standard bolter without any other keywords. Don't expect the Mandrake shooting to do much more than chip damage outside of the Abyssal. The chip damage is still useful, since it might mean the difference between one-shotting someone in melee versus getting hit back once before they go down, but just don't expect to be shooting many operatives off the board. Just soften targets up, and then go in for the kill. Alright, so a quick overall summary of the Mandrakes team. In KT24, the Mandrakes team is a team of slippery nightmare operatives that traps and ensnares unsuspecting opponents. The Mandrake operatives feel flavorful and impactful, with each specialist fulfilling an important role to make the overall engine work. If you're a player that enjoys high-level strategy and stifling your opponent's game plans, this team will really speak to you. Similarly to the guide that we did on Phobos Strike Team, the Mandrakes are not a durable team, so there's a real sense of struggle when eking out these wins. They have a lot of play into most teams that exist in the game right now, but they are definitely running up into some hard counters in the form of ultra-durable Marine teams. Even those matchups aren't unwinnable, but they will take some extra effort to craft a suitable game plan. I really enjoyed taking this team to the World Championships of Warhammer in 2024, and this team allowed me to keep every game that I played competitive. I would highly encourage other players to give them a go, or at least get some games against them to challenge your creative problem-solving skills. Alright, and that will wrap up our introduction to the Mandrakes team in KT24. If you've made it this far into the video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel so that you don't miss out on our other guide videos as well. I know the Mandrakes team is an unusual one, so if you have any tricks or tips of your own, please leave them in the comments section so that others can try them out and so that I can try them out. More guides like this are coming soon, so stay tuned and let me hear your requests. Until next time, have fun and be good if you want to.